Hi everyone, my name's John Bloomfield. I'm joined today by Matt O'Connor, who's the Director of Assessor Quality Management. So today we're going to be talking about INFI, which stands for Items Noted for Improvement. And I've got to say, I personally think it's a bit of a groundbreaking tool. It's been introduced in version 4. It's got significant benefits for a range of different organizations.
John, hang on. I was going to tell everyone about compensating controls, so it's not all about INFI, is it?
Okay, it's not just all about INFI. Apologies for a little bit of an oversight there. So what we're going to be doing, we're going to be discussing a range of different reporting options, and particularly we're going to highlight some of those differences that we've got between compensating controls and INFI. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll hand it over to Matt now, and he can talk about our compensating controls.
Thanks, John. So compensating controls, they are intended to help entities address the risk where there is a technical constraint or a business constraint that prevents the entity meeting the PCI DSS requirement as stated. So they're proactive, and only entities that have a legitimate and documented technical constraint or business constraint can consider the use of compensating controls in order to achieve compliance. Now, these constraints mean that the entity can't meet that PCI DSS requirement as it is stated. Now, typically, we would see a compensating control documented by the entity that's using it, and then it's reviewed by the assessor. But assessors can assist entities in developing compensating controls. But if they're involved at any level with them, they can't assess it, so they would need another QSA from their company to review that particular requirement. A few points here to note. So a business convenience and or a desire to please customers, that's not a constraint. Poor planning is not a valid reason to use a compensating control because, as we said, it's proactive. And compensating controls cannot be used with the customized approach.
So just before we get into starting to really have a discussion about INFI, let's set the stage here with a bit of a fictitious example. And that's going to help illustrate these different reporting options. So now picture this. We've got an organization, and they've got this clean air requirement for employees commuting to and from the office. And the requirement itself is that staff members must cycle to and from work 5 days a week to reduce air pollution. Now, if a staff member consistently cycles to work 5 days a week, and they've got a recorded travel diary, then that requirement is going to be in place. Now, conversely, if that member of staff decides to ride their personal quad bike, it's obviously going to be not in place.
So let's apply a compensating control then to this clean air requirement. So during severe weather, it would not be safe for staff members to cycle to work. So when the weather's bad, the company provides a shuttle bus. So there's one shuttle bus that drives around and collects up each individual staff member. So rather than multiple vehicles, it's one vehicle collecting everybody, and so the intent of the requirement is still being met, reduced air pollution. Now, the company's documented this as an acceptable alternative when it's not safe for their staff to cycle. Now, on the topic of compensating controls, we've got some data we'd like to share with you that was obtained via the QSA questionnaire program. So the left-hand vertical axis, that represents the 12 main PCI DSS requirements. And the horizontal axis just represents the number of compensating controls we've seen applied to each requirement. Now, for brevity, we're just going to look at the top 4. Now, of these compensating controls, some, yep, they appeared to be legitimate use cases. So there was a legitimate technical constraint or a legitimate business constraint that prevented the entity meeting the requirement as stated. Conversely, though, some of the compensating controls we reviewed, probably more for convenience and not because of a technical or business constraint. So fourth place then, requirement 11, regularly test security systems and processes. We had a couple of questionable scenarios we identified here. So one entity could not produce a valid scan of its production environment and so submitted their test scan instead. Another entity couldn't test its network segmentation. Third place, requirement 6, develop and maintain secure systems and applications. One of the questionable scenarios here was that an entity wasn't applying critical patches. Requirement 3, second place, protects stored cardholder data. Now, we've seen instances here where cardholder data was retained unnecessarily, and other instances where an entity used a customized control to justify the storage of SAD post-authorization. And then in first place, requirement 8, identify and authenticate access to system components. Now, there's one entity here where they were not using unique IDs when accessing root accounts. Now, if you're wondering why this particular requirement is significantly higher than the others, we saw a lot of compensating controls here applied to the cloud environment. And again, as we said earlier, some, yep, absolutely legitimate use cases, and others not.
So we've probably heard quite a bit about compensating controls. Can I talk about INFI now?
We ought to cover it.
OK. So items noted for improvement. It's this new reporting tool in PCI DSS assessments, and it's been designed to be used in those assessments between the assessor and the assessed entity. Now, in essence, what happens with INFI, it comes into play when a PCI DSS requirement hasn't been met. However, this is the important part here, is that the entity has not only rectified that control failure, but they've also implemented measures to ensure it's not going to happen again in the future. OK, so here's what you need to know about INFI. It's reactive in its nature. And what it's doing, it's assessing lapses in that kind of control that's come around from an unexpected or really exceptional situation. And then once identified, the cause of that lapse has been addressed, and the requirement is now deemed to be in place. So before we just proceed from this and go on a little bit further, one thing I want to mention here, very similar to the compensating controls, is that poor planning isn't going to be a valid reason for using INFI. So going back to our example, if you remember, we had that clean air requirement where staff members had to cycle to and from work 5 days a week. Now, imagine this scenario. On the 4th day, a member of staff had to drive to work because they had a puncture. And as a result, that requirement's not met. But then to address this going forward, what the company's done, they've given all of the staff members a puncture repair kit, told them how to fix a puncture. So what's going to happen is, going forward, if any member of staff were to get a puncture going to work, they could fix it and resume cycling to work. So the result of this is going to be an example of compliant with items noted for improvement. Oh, my word. I think Tom's been changing our slides here. But anyway, what I've got to say here, what about, Matt, requirements where, we've got that kind of legal exception? What would we do there?
OK, quite simple. The assessor completes the ROC as normal, and then when the particular requirement that has a legal exception, for that, they mark it as not in place and document it. And then within the attestation of compliance, within section 3, PCI DSS validation, they tick the box that says compliant with legal exception. And then in the table below, they enter the requirement number or numbers, and they just enter details of how that legal exception prevents the requirement from being met. Now, a couple of points, though, that you don't need a compensating control and you don't need an INFI worksheet if you have a legal exception. So I think we should apply compensating control and INFI to a PCI DSS 4 requirement. What do you think, John? I
think that's probably a good idea. So I think what might be quite useful, let's literally discuss the elephant in the room, because there is one requirement in PCI DSS that historically and still does generate an awful lot of discussion within the community. I wonder if you can guess what it might be. Well, that's going to be in requirement 4, it's 11.3.2. And that's more commonly known to you all as those external vulnerability scans, the ASV scans. So just here, we've actually got an extract just from PCI DSS on a really high level here. As you probably know, those scans need to be conducted once every 3 months. They need to be performed by a PCI SSC-approved scanning vendor. Those vulnerabilities need to be addressed, and then you need to have that kind of rescan to make sure everything's been resolved. So just before we go on and try and apply this, a quick recap then of those reporting options.
So as we said, compensating controls, they're proactive, they're planned for, and it's to address a known business constraint or a known technical constraint whereby the entity can't meet the requirement as stated, and therefore they need to implement alternative controls. Again, business convenience or a wish to please the customer is not a constraint. Poor planning, that's not a valid reason to use a compensating control. And the compensating controls cannot be used with the customized approach.
Now, just one thing I want to tag on to the end of that is that the customized approach can't be used for every single PCI DSS version 4 requirement. And incidentally, 11.3.2 is just one of those requirements. So just remember, whenever you're thinking about those kind of customized approach, if you're going to go down that route, just make sure you can be using it. So a quick recap then on INFI. So as we touched on, it stands for those items noted for improvement. It's a reactive tool, and basically it's tackling those kind of control lapses that are stemming from that, exceptional or unexpected situation. And then it's something where it was temporarily not in place, but now it's been fixed and it's been safeguarded going forward in the future. And again, that poor planning doesn't justify using INFI. So let's try and a quick discussion here about what we would traditionally expect. And don't get me wrong, this is a really high-level snapshot here. You've got to obviously complete all of the points that are in the requirement. But for example, in place would be you've got an entity, and they can provide evidence of the successful scans at least once every 3 months. And conversely, if they can't evidence those 3 scans, once a quarter, a scan once every quarter, then it will be not in place. So, do you know what? He's been all over these slides. I don't know. I'm going to have a word with Tom about this, but here we go. Go on, Matt.
So in this scenario then, the business is going to be introducing a new online service, and it wants to ensure maximum availability. So for 1 quarter only, it's going to suspend ASV scans. Now, prior to this, it can evidence 3 quarters of passing scans, and additionally, to mitigate the risk, it's deployed traffic monitoring. It's enhanced its anomaly detection, and it's deployed advanced threat intelligence. Now, once the new service has been launched and the initial intense traffic has subsided, the company then resumes ASV scans until such time as they can evidence a passing scan. Okay? Now remember, it's proactive, so it's all planned for in advance. It's not retro applied. Now, as we said in that example, that it is just that, an example. Now, the exact controls in this example may differ between organizations. And again, the scenario, the approach is focused on operational insights and security goals. But it might differ from the views of the assessing body or indeed the QSA. So I think as the last presentation alluded, if you're dealing with compensated controls, then communicate with your report accepting entity and your QSA as early as possible in the process. That's absolutely critical.
Okay, so when we touch on, in comparison, those items noted for improvement. So in this example we've got here, so we've got an ASV scan for, and it's resulted in really quite an exceptional number of vulnerabilities. And while all of these were remediated, it was not possible to actually go through and have a rescan in that same quarter before a business change freeze came into effect. Now, what you've actually got here is the organization thinking about this to make sure it doesn't happen again in the future. They've decided to try and push forward some of those scan dates. So it's going to occur earlier in the quarter. And then hopefully they're going to have enough time to remediate any issues. And importantly, they evidenced a passing scan immediately they were outside of that change freeze period.
So I Guessing a lot of people's going to have questions. Shall we see if we can address some of those?
Sure. OK.
So, John, will PCI DSS be providing an INFI template?
Well, we already have created that INFI template. So we have PCI DSS version 4 items noted for improvement worksheet, bit of a mouthful there, but it's the INFI worksheet for short. And as I was saying, this is really a tool, and it's for collaboration between the assessor and the entity. And really its primary goals are it's enabling an idea about the whole security posture for that organization. So it's enhancing the overall understanding, and it's streamlining some of those security processes. And it's really good at highlighting this continuous improvement process. And there's a really good added benefit as well of the INFI worksheet, because it's providing a channel for organizations to be showing to senior management, and it can give an indication of where the organization is struggling.
So should QSAs complete an INFI worksheet for every assessment?
The short answer here is yes. So what's happening here is a QSA is going to have to do an INFI worksheet for every single assessment. Now, the one point I want to add here, even if there are no INFI findings at all, a QSA is still going to have to create that INFI worksheet. So there's a part in there which is the accessor acknowledgement and attestation section. We're going to read it there. But anyway, what it is, it's even if there are no items noted for improvement, what the assessor's going to do, they'll just mark in there, no. It's as simple. That's all they've got to do. Now, if there are going to be items there, what the assessor will do, they'll mark down every single item into that worksheet that's been identified during the assessment, and then they're going to be providing a copy of that to the assessed entity, and importantly, they need to have a copy of that in their work papers.
So the QSA's completed the INFI worksheet, so who has to sign it?
So the QSA has to sign that INFI worksheet, but there's no requirement for the representative of the entity to sign that INFI worksheet, but they can sign it if they want to.
Okay. Now, if a QSA is assisting an entity with an SAQ, INFI, can that be used there?
So, right. No, it's a simple answer. But so if a QSA, they're going in and they're helping an entity go through an SAQ, and they might have done something, for example, validating a requirement by doing some testing, then the QSA's due diligence is going to be that they should record any of those issues that need any kind of corrective action. So it's recommended that a QSA would do that, but it's not required.
Okay. And internal security assessors, if they're undertaking an assessment for their company, are they required to complete an INFI worksheet?
Again, ISAs are, they're encouraged to, but they are not required to. The requirement is only for those QSAs.
So finally then, INFI, can that be used with PCI DSS version 3.2.1?
And the answer is yes, it can. While the INFI worksheet has been designed to be used for PCI DSS version 4, it still can be used for assessments done under 3.2.1. So we would recommend people use it, but it doesn't have to be used. So hopefully, it's not just about INFI. So we've discussed those kind of compensating controls today. But I think hopefully what you'll be able to see is that INFI is now a really valuable tool for improving organization security posture year on year. And as a result, it can add a real benefit to organizations to really understand where controls start to lapse.
So, PCI DSS, we've been asked many questions about version 4 of PCI DSS, and now to discuss some of those, and the timeline, and the roadmap, I would like to welcome to the stage, please, Emma Sutcliffe.
Cheers, thank you.